Welcome to Abolitionist Social Work in Unsettling Times. Before we get started today, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that for us panelists, we're meeting and assembled in various spaces of settler colonial rule, from Turtle Island to the Hawaiian archipelagos, and to really think through the ways in which we, as social workers or people speaking to the topics of social work in these books, are situated within that ongoing dispossession. Particularly, social workers have long history of playing a role of dispossessing Indigenous children from their families, and of shifting communities from their home bases to reserves and other spaces where they now reside. So we want to take a moment here to recognize that the work that we're doing here is in solidarity with Indigenous forms of decolonization throughout North America, but also, of course, the Hawaiian Islands and other places around the world globally, including in Palestine. So thank you so much for everybody for tuning in. And I will pass it to Cameron to introduce us for today.
Thanks so much, Craig, and welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us, especially for the folks who are watching live. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I'm just going to briefly frame the event, and then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. I mean, in some ways, this is an event about the role and place of abolition in social work in this moment that we're in, where fascism is on the rise, genocide in Palestine and other places has been ongoing. And in other ways, it's a joint book event between two texts that sort of are looking at a similar set of things in different parts of North America, or what is some people call North America, Turtle Island. And so we've been wanting to do this event for a while. There's a book that Craig helped to edit called Abolish Social Work as We Know It. And and we have some of the co-authors of that book here, Senna and Chanel. And then there's a book called Abolition and Social Work that Mimi, Darrell, and I put together. And so we have been in conversation about organizing an event, and it's happening now, and it's happening at a pivotal time in terms of fighting fascism and fighting against authoritarianism and thinking about the role of social work in this moment. And so that's our conversation is going to be a bit about the emergence of these two books and how they came to be, and then looking at lessons from abolition and social work that we might sort of think about applying in this moment, and also about the role of social workers in this moment. So with that, I'm going to briefly introduce myself, and then I'm going to pass it to Chanel. My name is Cameron. I currently live in the island of Oahu, which is a part of Hawaii. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Hawai'i, and I'm a longtime organizer and anti-carceral person. So Chanel, with that, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Cameron. Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Chanel Gallant. I'm one of the contributors to the book Abolition Social Work, or Abolish Social Work as We Know It, sorry. I am, let's see, well, I am the daughter of a poor teen mom, and my family has been directly impacted by criminal legal systems and the family regulation systems. I've basically spent my entire life in movement in one way or another, starting out as a baby activist suing the cops with my feminist collective when they raided our queer sex parties, to now I'm basically a middle-aged movement lady, and I write, I train, I teach, I consult, I coach, all the things. And it's great. I'm glad to have made it this far. And I am the co-author of another Haymarket book, which is called Not Your Rescue Project, Migrant Sex Workers Fighting for Justice, which I co-authored with Elaine Lamb. And I'm delighted to be here as a contributor to Abolish Social Work as We Know It. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Senna.
Sorry about the tech issues. So I'll start from the top again. My name is Senna. My pronouns are she, her. And I've been working at an organization here in Toronto called PASAN. In October, it would be 9 years. And my main role at PASAN is as the editor of Cell Count, which is a newspaper that goes out to prisoners across Turtle Island. And we mainly focus on health and harm reduction. with contributions from prisoners, including articles, poetry, and artwork. And so I just got into the master's program at the University of Toronto for social work. So it will be my last year as the editor of Cell Count, which is very sad for me, but I'm excited to talk about two amazing contributors to Cell Count that were featured in this book.
The co-editors of Abolish Social Work as we know it. And I'm currently an associate professor in the Department of Social Development Studies at the University of Waterloo, Renison University College. But I've been a long time organizer in the city of Toronto, particularly within migrant justice, anti-capitalist, and queer movements. And yeah, I'm really excited to be on this panel with all y'all. And last but not least, let's go to Darrell.
Excited to hear from especially folks who edited and contributed to the other book. I think me, Kim, and Mimi have been going hard with these talks since last April. It's about to be a full year since we started doing these. So yeah, excited for the convo, and I think I'm passing back to Kim. Maybe. Ooh.
Over to Craig.
Sorry. Craig.
It's me, but we did a last minute audible, so it's not on you. So thanks so much for those intros. We're really just really grateful for y'all coming in, tuning in, folks on the live stream and folks who are going to watch us later. What we wanted to do before we got started was just give you a sense of sort of the genesis of these two projects, how they came about, and sort of maybe how they kind of speak to each other in this particular context and historical moment. So I'm going to throw it to Cam and Darrell and Mimi to kind of give us a sense of sort of where your book emerged, what was that historical timeline, and why now, and why is it so important? And obviously, probably folks watching know why it's obviously important, but I'd love to hear a little bit from y'all.
Hello, everybody. Hope you're still with us. I'm just going to continue talking going back a little bit in terms of the historical context of our work in abolition. Some of this for us dates back 1998 with the first conference of critical resistance, which was really an important moment in the contemporary political history in terms of a gathering that just brought together these forces that were just amazing. I think there were at least a couple of thousand people at that meeting talking, really maybe not using the framework so much of abolition as the framework of the prison industrial complex, and really bringing together people inside, activists, educators, organizers, people across so many different sectors to talk about the prison industrial complex and what we were calling then maybe for the first time, mass and hyper incarceration in the United States as really already a phenomenon that had been escalating so rapidly since the early 1970s, but of course has been with us since the beginning of the colonization of what we now call the United States. So many of us were at that conference, many of us who I think identified with kind of a radical feminist movement, and many of us who were really part of working in domestic violence and sexual assault were there, and really were starting to have our own conversations in the wake of the 1994 Violence Against Women Act as part of the crime bill. A lot of us had been extremely disturbed by that moment, not only in terms of violence against women being considered a crime and used as an excuse to actually pass an incredibly draconian crime bill in 1994, but also the way in which feminists were completely silent about the collusion that we'd had with law enforcement, to the point where we would be applauding and relying on the passage of that bill. So many of you are very familiar with this at the time. I think then, I mean, this was a silent topic. By 2000, a number of us had gotten together nationally to start talking about not being on the sidelines of the conversations, but actually bringing ourselves to the center of the conversation. And that's where Insight started in 2000 as a gathering we thought we might be lucky to get 200 people coming to, and 2,000 people tried to get in, primarily people of color, women, femme, queer, transgender people of color, but of course, many, many other people that came together in Santa Cruz and really started a conversation together with and as abolitionists, together with some of the things that had really been ignited in 1998 with the Critical Resistance Conference, but really naming our common political agendas, but also some of the differences that we had, that we as people that were working in a feminist anti-violence movement, for those of us who were, and many of us were, really had to name the ways in which we had colluded with law enforcement, and hence the term that we didn't use then, but we have since used carceral feminism, which is really familiar now, that carceral feminism had already been a phenomenon for a long time, still is, but it was something that many of us came directly against. And then we really named the violence of the state as part of a core part of the problem, and as a major institution that was fomenting violence in all forms. And from that, I think so many things came out of the Insight moment. I do think that I had some influence in the US, but also outside of the borders, internationally and globally. And that we've really, I do think we didn't call ourselves abolition feminists at the time, but I would say that a lot of the different kinds of political frameworks, but also our movement practices, including some of the things that I think are now included in probably both books, came out of a direct challenge to the carceral practices that we had in, I didn't really call that social work at the time, but it certainly is part of social work, the caring professions, whatever we want to call it, care work. And really naming what we do that's different, that's challenging, that is dismantling of institutions, that's profoundly questioning institutions, and that is creating new kinds of frameworks and practices that, as we name, are possibilities, paradoxes, and practices of care. So I can speak more of the in-between time, but I just wanted to kick us off that way. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mimi. I'm going to pick up a little bit on what you're offering. I mean, I think there are lots of different lineages of our book, and I'm sure of the other book here. I mean, one of the things about the 2010s, at least for me, was a growing recognition, at least in some corners of social work, that social work was complicit in carceral punishment and in state violence. Some of that is because of people like Mimi who wrote articles that made it possible for those of us in classrooms to say, wait a second, this is not so great. And then we have the movement for Black Lives. We have a sort of massive recognition of police violence, particularly against Black folks and people of color in the United States. And at some point, there was a recognition of this term carceral social work, to say that social work often is, if not almost always, has some relationship to carcerality. And that recognition, I think, allowed many of us to understand and critique social work. With then a sort of growing movement for abolition, it allowed us to say, wait a second, we want to critique and maybe get rid of some of it. There's debates about how much social work we should get rid of, but it also gave an opening to say, what is it that we want to do, and how do we both sort of practice a politics of destruction, but also a politics of building? And I mean, that was sort of one of the impetuses for this book, was we wanted to wrestle with some of the critiques, some of the paradoxes, but also sort of look at what's the world that we want, what's the role of social work in that, and what are some ways that people we know in the social work world broadly are trying to do that. I mean, one other sort of lineage of this book is that there was a group of folks in 2015-16 in New York City who created a group called Social Workers Against Criminalization. And this was in part based on a woman named Cassandra Frederique, who's now the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. But she was sort of calling some of us in that community of social workers to say, let's look at the relationship between social work and carceral systems. We had lots of good ideas. We didn't do a whole lot. 2020 happened. The head of the NAASW at the time went on MSNBC and said, you know, social workers have police back, they have our back, we need more of this. And many of us were like, no, this is not the move. And so that critique of police social work collaborations led to the formation of what is now called the Network to Advance Abolition and Social Work. We did a webinar with Haymarket. Haymarket reached out to us and asked if we wanted to put together a book, and now 5 years later we have this powerful text. So with that, I'm going to pass to you, Darrell, to talk about the sort of frame of the book and what it's offering.
Yeah, my sound's coming in. Checking new platform, just making sure. All right, great. No, I appreciate everything Kim and Mimi said, and even the idea about the book was presented to Kim and Mimi, and they invited me to join them. So I always want to express my appreciation for being able to take this ride, because I'm sure everyone on the panel knows kind of doing this is hard work, like putting these books together. But also something I think we've mentioned in other talks that we did, but is so, I don't want to use the word crazy, but like just so ironic to think about when we first started doing this, the times we were in look very different than it is now, right? Like these books come out, the world like politically is where it's at. And a lot of people think it's like, it's I think for both texts is really, really timely. And I'll say something else in a little more detail when I get to one of the sections of the book. But I think especially social work's response to what's going on right now politically has been not surprising for me at all. But it's just really ironic sometimes how things align. So the book is really broken down into these three parts around possibilities, paradoxes, and praxis. And I think, the possibilities section is I think what a lot of folks who have any kind of abolitionist politic does very well, is to kind of envision and imagine what does it look like, not to create a new social work, but kind of what would it look like to bring abolitionist principles to the social work profession. Which is, this first section. But I think kind of the paradoxes portion is what I've actually been thinking about a lot lately, is about these tensions between what social work says it's supposed to do and how it's actually being practiced on a day-to-day. So I don't know how much, me as someone who's in kind of the academy per se, I was just on Blue Sky a few days ago, and there was a lot of conversation around the social workers who's there around this special issue that just was released in the Journal of Social Work Education. And it's a bunch of articles. I'm going to try to, excuse my French on this panel for right now. But basically that is kind of talking about how anti-racism, critical race theory, decolonization, all these things that we try to have a conversation about is actually harming social work practice. And the first thing I thought about was I just retweeted, and it was like, this presidential administration would be proud of social work, like right now, to have kind of a special issue like this that is written by a lot of leaders, like people who are elected as leaders in the academy of the profession, to really kind of say that talking about like Black people, Palestinian lives, and all these folks who've been harmed is like detrimental to the training of social work scholars. And even one person, I got to look at it a little more in depth, but I couldn't really stomach it. It's talking about a new term, talking about Black supremacy. is a thing now, and like whatever this means. So it's very frustrating, and it's saying like social justice, that the way that we think about social justice is wrong. And it's very much telling, because one thing I've always said, and that's been a huge conversation, is that social work history isn't really told in the right way, around how like racist and how involved in like eugenics and all these other things. The fact that we had racially divided settlement houses and all these different things, the people who were excluded, the contributions that's not talked about as far as in the social work profession, it's just kind of resurfacing. So it's very much interesting. So, this possibility, the paradoxes portion talks about these conundrums, which is even more present now. And then the last section, which, I think most people in our conversations that I'm really most interested in, is on praxis, which is some practical steps that you can take today to get to the future that we want to see. And what I love about the volume is that all the authors don't agree on the steps that we could take. You can see the differences in conversations as you read across it, and I think that's healthy. And I think that's it leaves room for everyone who's thinking about things in a very different way, what this could look like. So if you have questions around, well, what can I do? I think you take a look at the book. It's not an exhaustive list. There's so much that's missing, right? There's so many pieces to the conversation that we haven't touched. That just means maybe it's your time to write something, to host a panel, or to do a thing to contribute to the conversation. So excited to see where this conversation goes, and to learn, especially from the other editors and authors for this other book around what's next. And Cam, I'm not sure who I'm passing to.
I got you. Thank you so much, Darrell. Okay. Craig, Chanel, and Senna, we want to hear about the emergence of Abolish Social Work as we know it, how it came to be. And I know we're going to start with Craig. So Craig, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Also just really excited to hear a little bit of that backstory from y'all as well. So I feel like we can kind of pick up where Mimi started, because I think for a lot of us, we kind of were the generation of organizers and activists that were needing guidance at a time when those insight books came out in the mid 2000s, right? And that was really crucial, so like The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, The Color of Violence, these type of books, I think spoke to the kind of tension that we were holding in our community. For most of us, in the circles that I was running with, we were doing community-based organizing. Myself and Edward, who's one of the co-editors of the book, met through No One Is Illegal Toronto, where we were doing work with undocumented people fighting detentions and deportations, and pushing for a national regularization program that, if you've been following the news, our political party had put on the table as a policy that was looking to be passed in 2024, and then the rightward shift and surge canceled everything, and now they've moved to a very far-right immigration policy within a few minutes. So this is the shifting terrain I think we're really engaged in, right? But around that time, at least myself and a few other folks that I know, we were kind of balancing that tension between doing community-based organizing and what I guess we call activist work, and our daytime jobs being community service work. Some of us had formal social work degrees, others didn't, but we were working to kind of link people with services and resources and help them fight to get access to things that they needed for their survival. And it was a real struggle, right? And it was a real struggle to kind of live in that dissonance between the kind of power we had doing the organizing work, the ability to get people access, for instance, undocumented people access to food banks, versus the limitations and the bureaucracy and the harm that was going on in our workplaces, in our paid jobs, right? And I think that tension really got us talking and thinking. And so that was an ongoing conversation between Edward and myself for a long time. And when both of us ended up in PhD programs where we were now teaching this stuff, we were realizing how, and I'm going to actually just say how fucked up the social work education programs were, right? That they were teaching a very narrow history that really seemed like it hadn't changed in about 100 years in terms of how they kind of narrate the story of social work as a profession. And at least in the Canadian context, there's this notion that it sort of comes through this benevolent process. And so Edward and I were really interested in figuring out, well, like, how do we understand this? And what we found in our archival work is that in Canada, at least, social workers were heavily invested in taking the role of the Indian agent. The Indian agent was a government sort of hybrid security, hybrid social service provider on reservations in Canada that made sure that Indigenous people never left their territories, that that distribution of resources came through them directly. They meted out punishment, they meted out various forms of control, linguistic control, and so on and so forth. And in the 1950s, when those agents went out of favor and went out of sort of political sort of prestige, social workers lobbied to take over those roles. And in the 1960s in Canada, we had something called the 60s scoop, where social workers went into Indigenous territories and removed children, placing them in homes that didn't speak their languages, that were predominantly white settler homes, where these young people face a whole whack of abuse and harm and disconnection from community that generation upon generation is still reeling from today. And so this was sort of an important piece of what we wanted to contribute back into the discourse, because I think for us to be able to hold up all of these young people who want to help people, who want to be in community, who want to do the work, but yet are confronted with these really, and as Cam and Mimi and Darrell framed it, really carceral frameworks for how to do this stuff in their education. We wanted to be able to build the kind of sort of literature that we had these, these small little pieces of books from Insight and some other radical organizers, but there wasn't like an actual sort of focus on social work as like a tool for political organizing. And that was really a part of our journey. And so through my connections with what was the Abolition Journal, where we held a convergence in Minneapolis in 2017, I was set to help co-organize a larger convergence in Toronto in 2020. In fact, in May of 2020, but a little thing happened that forced us to cancel our in-person event. We had almost 5,000 people register for that convergence. And one of the major sort of sections was going to be a discussion on abolitionist social work. And so this is where Edward and I met Nicole Pennock, who originally was one of the co-editors and who suggested MJ, who's our third co-editor, to be involved. And when we sat down and talked about it, we really emphasized the necessity and need to not necessarily just have people who were social workers or social work educators, but rather people who were doing the kind of like care work in community that we imagined would be a transformative space if we could get resources and funding to support one another, but also people whose lives had been impacted, whether they are currently incarcerated or whether they have lived in situations like, as Chanel said in her introduction, where social work was an intrusive part of their lives, right? And so we took a really broad look at what social work was and what it could be, and also really challenged our authors to think about like turning that lens inward and what it means to abolish social work as we know it, right? And I think this is a question that we have to take seriously as people who are part of this sort of pyramid scheme that we call social work, right? This professionalized social work in which the profession itself is rooted in a particular framework that establishes a professional identity that disconnects people from being able to do, the kind of care work that we do in communities day in, day out, and not be recognized for that work. So this was a real big part of the conversation we had. And the way we went about inviting people into that project was through this real relational work, talking with people we knew, being able to connect with people we had done work with collaboratively. And that's where I think maybe I'll ask Chanel to maybe kick us off, but that's sort of how folks were introduced into that conversation. And I wonder if Chanel and Senna, you could both talk a little bit about your experiences contributing to the book and some of the process that we've had, because it was a long journey. About 5 years it took us from start to finish to get this book started.
Do you want to go, Senna? Do you want me to? Go ahead. Okay, I will. Okay, hi everyone. Well, yeah, hearing you all talk about the journey that actually, starts with the colonization of the Americas, and then let's fast forward to 1999 and that critical resistance conference, that actually layers on pretty closely to how I ended up in this book too. So I became an abolitionist while I was answering prisoner mail at Critical Resistance in Oakland in 2009. Yeah. And at the time, I was very anti-police, as any sensible person whose family had been impacted by policing and incarceration would be. But abolition still seemed like, I don't get it. How could that work? And then prisoner mail. And this is why I'm excited to be in this collection as well with your work, Senna, because Senna included the voices of incarcerated people, and they were familiar to me. They reminded me of my own family members, and I loved that. I loved watching them, actually, people who are even incarcerated, wrestle with prisons, and so I was answering these prisoner mail, and the injustice of it just shattered my heart. And then I became an abolitionist because I was just like, I can't support this, even if I can't imagine yet how our society will work without it. And then I read the Incite books cover to cover, and I start working with Elaine Lamb, who is founding a migrant sex worker organization in Toronto. And I hear about the Incite conference happening. And this must have been, maybe you can tell me what year. I'm guessing it was like 2015, 2014, something like that. There was another Incite Women of Color Against Violence conference. And I was like, Elaine, I think these are your people. You got to go. So she goes, comes back, and starts to also develop an abolitionist politic. And so we're like working together, and our politic is developing together as we work with hyper-criminalized immigrants in the sex industry, right? We're actually in the process of figuring out abolition and figuring out what the PIC looks like in the lives of immigrants in the sex industry. And that shaped so much our understanding of the problem, because we were able to understand then that the anti-trafficking laws and the anti-trafficking industry were an extension of the prison industrial complex that typically masked itself as care, right? As services, as a protection. And we had a way of understanding this. And so fast forward then, Craig, you reached out to me and asked me to contribute. And the great thing was, I normally always write about sex work and racial justice. I have done that for a long time. I have many, many, many articles on the subject. And for this one, I was like, I don't have to be the one who writes that piece. In fact, my co-author, Elaine, wrote a whole piece on migrant sex work and the anti-trafficking industry. And I was like, great. I wrote a piece on non-compliance. I wrote a piece on what it looks like from my perspective as someone whose family has been social worked, and someone who has done some work in direct services for sex workers. And then also seen the collaboration between social workers and the cops, direct collaboration that has led to charges and detention and deportations. How social workers can bring an abolitionist principle in part through noncompliance. And I wanted that to be, I wanted to push against the professionalism. You know what I mean? I wanted to push against the but this was just my job. and I know that people have to protect their themselves and their jobs and their people, and also this feels increasingly relevant. It's wild to look back now on a piece that I wrote years ago about noncompliance with unjust regimes, and think through now. I've been kind of forced to think through a bit more, what does that look like more. What I've been realizing recently is noncompliance is actually a set of skills and practices, and you actually just can't jump right into that. And I want social workers to have some preparation and some practices for what it means to resist unjust authority. I'll put it that way. And so that's what my piece ended up focusing on. And I was happy that the editors had thought enough about sex work that didn't have to feel like my tokenistic contribution. And I got to bring to bear, other things that other conversations to the book. So I think I'm gonna pause there and pass it to you, Sana.
Thank you. So what brought me to the book was actually Craig reaching out and wanting my insights as the editor of Cell Count. So I would say in the beginning, when I first started working for Passan, I maybe had more of a theoretical idea of prison abolition. And once I started doing the work and talking to people inside, that really shaped my views on abolition a lot, because the two contributors that I talked about in the chapter and whose work is featured, Nolan and Zachariah, they both encountered the system at like age, I think they were both aged 19. And I just think that, like, having known them and talked to them for so many years, and seeing all the efforts that they have made towards like transformation, or trying to engage in personal transformation, and how the prisons actually actively stop people from doing that and don't allow people to grow in the ways that they need to actually get out of the system, which is like what they say it's set up to do, is rehabilitation, right? So I just saw how it was all lies. Like, the reasons for these prisons existing, it's all lies. It's like meant to actually keep people in there perpetually. And even with the parole system, it's all set up to keep people in there, because the more people that are in the prisons, the more money there is, to keep these systems going. And it was great to be able to reach out to Zachariah and Nolan at the time. Zachariah was incarcerated and he's out now, to ask them to contribute, to actually have their work published in a book. I think that already them publishing their work in Cell Count was so big for them and such a huge part of their transformation. And being able to be published in a book, I just, I thought that would be such a huge opportunity for them, and for people to be able to read their work as well, and to see that people inside, they're politically organized as well. And all the rights that you see that they have now are because they fought for it. I've been to a prison museum in Kingston, And I saw, you know, some of the tactics that they would use back in the day. It was, you know, basically torture chambers. And what we see now in prisons compared to then, it's all because of people fighting these things along the way. And you know, just I saw the courage that it takes to actually fight from that place of incarceration, because people are watched 24/7 by cops that get away with stuff all the time. So basically, they have absolutely no protection whatsoever when they're in there, but they're still resisting and they're still fighting. And I think that there's so many lessons to be learned about abolition from people inside. You know, when we're organizing out here, abolitionist movements and stuff like that. So yeah, I was very happy to make that connection. And I know it was really huge for them as well. And it's very heartening to hear that, you know, people are reading their work, and that it like their words are now part of these discussions. And you know, my goal is to see more of that happening and more of those voices being added, because, you know, you have people, I talk to people about like prison labor and how that works, and, you know, I'll be on the phone with them and be taking notes about, okay, you know, you have different tiers of workers, and like each tier gets like a different pay grade, for example, where, you know, often prisoners who can't work because of, you know, being disabled or, you know, mental health, they'll get the lowest grade, and so they'll get like literally something like $1.67 a day, you know. So like I encourage him to write for cell count and to get it out there, because a lot of people don't know this stuff, and I feel like when it's spoken or written about by folks inside, it's just so much more powerful because there's emotion behind it, versus when you have a researcher going in and kind of like asking people questions, it kind of sometimes takes that emotion out of it. And so yeah, working with the contributions I received for cell count, you can see it there. So it's people can really connect with the struggles that people are going through inside. So again, I'm really happy that, you know, people are getting to experience that in the book, and just knowing that it's going to students as well of social work. You know, I when I was doing my Bachelor of Social Work, I didn't encounter any readings or any anything that was directly coming from prisoners. It was more so like academics or activists writing about like sort of the general idea of prison abolition, but, you know, getting to actually talk to people and bringing those voices in, I think will really, you know, yeah, it's just going to help push the movement forward a lot faster and a lot more effectively. So yeah, that's kind of what brought me to this chapter.
Thank you so much, Senna. Thank you, Chanel. Thank you, Craig. I mean, just a couple things quickly. So folks inside are some of our greatest teachers, thinkers, organizers, and it's powerful that they're in the book. Chanel, the role of noncompliance like has always been an important thing, and then is increasingly, for so many, it's increasingly a more visible thing that people need to engage in. So I really appreciate that. And then Craig, I don't know if people can see it, but I'm looking at this like the idea that we need a library for organizing in and around social work, and I'm sort of seeing this little library here, and I'm wondering, this is not the extent of the library, obviously, but like where this library will go and grow. So I'm going to ask a question for all of us, and because of time, I'm going to ask us to be brief-ish. But the question is about, you know, can you think about a key lesson around abolition and social work, either connected to the book or not, that is relevant for this moment of rising authoritarianism and fascism, of sort of relentless genocide in Gaza and other places in the world. And is there anybody who feels eager to start this question?
I do.
Okay.
Chanel,
I'll
please.
say it again.
Go ahead, Chanel and Darrell.
Do you want to repeat the question, Cameron?
Yes, the question is about, can you offer a sort of key lesson for yourself about abolition and social work that can be connected to the book or not, and sort of how it relates to the context we're in of rising fascism and authoritarianism and ongoing relentless genocide in Gaza and other places in the world?
The thing I wanted to add is, just like when I was talking earlier, and I was like, what I've realized since I wrote this is that noncompliance does require skill and strategy. And so I started thinking, I've never really had to try to teach that to someone. You know what I mean? But of like 20 years of working with highly criminalized people, having a criminalized family, I'm like, well, what would I tell people about that? And so I wrote a little short list. And the first thing is to be in a small, trusted network of less than 12 people that shares information with each other about enforcement and resistance strategies. That's actually what people do. Like, you're in a little crew, you have a crew, and they're your trusted people. And if I was talking to my beloveds who were like, I'm concerned about increasing repression in some way, I would say, well, I think what most people do to protect themselves is they have a crew that they share information with about, they share information. And like, it's small, it's like a tight, trusted network. And that's kind of how people find out what enforcement looks like. Because, in my experience, there is no law, there's only enforcement. That's the only thing that really matters, is like, you have to know what enforcement is. And and then I was thinking, okay, more people need to get a little tighter on their security culture. And I was thinking, for social workers, I think I would ask social workers to teach us how to do DIY social work. Like, could you teach more of us how to do this? I think back to when I was in my 20s, and the first time I had a friend go into like a manic episode, or I was dealing with friends who were suicidal or dealing with real substance issues or in abusive relationships. And I was like, it probably would have been really good for like social workers to share more of what they know about how to social work. Could you DIY us a little bit more on how to do this shit, and share what you know about the social work institution and how to navigate it? Could you also help us navigate this institution? Because I don't think social workers know better. I don't think they know best, but they definitely know about social work. So it's like your friends who are trying to apply for disability and how incredibly hard that is. Like, what do you know about this? What are the like ways that the social work has like, what's the word? Screening or mandatory reporting. It's been really useful when somebody's explained to me, this person is a mandatory reporter. That's super useful. I don't know that, but social workers do. It helps us all to know that, right? Like, when I've had someone, have you ever had someone do this, where you're about to disclose something and they pause and say, I just want you to know, this is what I have to report if you disclose it to me. So helpful. Then you know what I mean? So those are just some of the things that I've thought since I wrote this, about how to get a little more granular on noncompliance, which is what I wrote about.
Thank you so much for that. Darrell, go ahead.
Oh, I more so wanted you to restate the question, but like, I'm happy to throw kind of some thoughts out, since I have kind of like a million. I think kind of where I'm at today is, I would love for us to be more organized with our intention. Like, rightfully so many people are angry and they're upset, but it's like, I feel like we're worried about the wrong thing. Like, right now, like, people are worried about like what Republicans are doing, what like Democrats aren't doing. And I feel like, as far as like from an abolitionist politic, I don't think we fit in left or right. Like, I don't think abolitionists fit in either of those political ideologies. But like, I've said this to Cam and Mimi in other spaces, but I've learned so much about community and like how to take care of one another from watching encampments around the country, and like how folks have galvanized and organized and taken care of each other, even when it came down to those who were okay with being arrested and those who weren't, and those who didn't want their names attached to anything, and how there wasn't judgment based on which like how aggressive you want it to be, if you want it to be in the front line, if you want it to be more of an organizer in the background, if you were like, as soon as I see cops and they tell me to leave, I'm leaving. There's no judgment. They're taking care of each other. There's accountability for folks who may have slipped up or whatever. And this is where I wish we could be, more within social work and those who claim to be about abolitionist organizing. And I think, rightfully so, we've been angry forever. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to tweet out things and write things, but it's like, where is kind of like the collective strategy and thinking about, well, how do we take care of those who's around us? How do we take care of ourselves and all those kind of things, rather than just throwing the energy out to people in organizations and institutions who've never had our back and have never cared. So it's like, why do we think like now this is the time that they're not just going to have their own interests at hand? And I think there's so much energy that can be put in other places. I think there's so many smaller wins that we could celebrate that we're not. And I just want, I just wish there was more of a conversation around like, how do we get rid of the finger pointing and get more into the thought process of like, how do we move forward in the time that just seems so stressful, like every moment of every day, and there's someone who is losing their job, someone who's afraid of losing their job, someone who's like, do I need to be silent, and all of those things. So I kind of think like my thing is like, how do we how do we bring our attention back to the things that matters most?
Thanks, Terrell. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and talk about maybe a couple of things that have been going through my mind recently. One is I've been going back to the book Weapons of the Weak by James C. Scott, because I think we're in a moment where, like, we have power, we have like people power, but we're weak politically, right? That the authoritarian regimes are rising globally. And in Weapons of the Weak, when they talk about weapons of the weak, he's not talking about weakness as like a it's not a derogatory thing for him, right? It's this idea that we have to think of the ways that we can foot drag, delay, obfuscate, pilfer, the kind of stuff that people do. We all do this on a day-to-day when we don't like our boss, when we don't like this and that. And I do think that these are kind of strategies that, kind of based on what Chanel is talking about, these are the kind of strategies we need to operationalize and teach each other and hold each other with great care and in solidarity when we're engaged in this stuff. And I can tell you, my first world, before, when I graduated university the first time, I was in accounting, and I was an accountant in the financial district here in Toronto. And what I learned was how creative and effective accountants are at pilfering money for companies, of like making the balance sheets balance even though money is being shifted in kind of gray areas. And when I began to work in social work and community and grassroots organizations, I saw how useful it was to take that skill and get money directly into the hands of young people, of poor people, of people with disabilities, with just a few little tweaks of our processes, right? That these 501c3, or, in Canada, we call them charitable or nonprofit organizations, that these regulations aren't as like they don't have an enforcement arm or mechanism for dealing with these small scale creative accounting things, right? And I'm not talking about fraud. I'm talking about just shifting money in the gray zone that it can get directly to community. Because I think a lot of the times, this is the issue, is that we have money just being wasted on garbage that we don't need, when it could be better used by people in community for survival, for support, and for solidarity. And so for me, this is a really big issue that I try and train people on here in Toronto, is this idea of like, how can we sort of manage those gray areas where if grants say you can do this and that, how can we do this and that, but also do that and that and that and that, right? And I think there are ways to do those things, but we are often so frozen by this fear of like balancing the books that we forget, I think, how easy it is to casually transfer funds, and still live up to the grant or the reporting body's expectations. And I think this is done all the time in the corporate sector, but it's something that I think, because maybe there's a lack of knowledge or lack of experience, but also because there's just a more rule-abiding sort of culture within people who have integrity and care. But I don't think, I do think these are really important moments where, to be able to resource struggle, we need to be able to find those gray areas, right? Whether that's in the academy or whether that's in community-based organizations, where we can effectively transfer funds to people who need it in the moment. And so that's something I think I wanted to contribute.
Thanks so much, Craig. Over to you.
As Chanel was talking about, social workers teach us how to DIY social work. It just occurred to me that social workers are very bad at DIYing anything, like, because we're, social workers are taught to practice within rules and procedures and institutions that are carceral, that are state bound. I'm not going to say that everybody does that. There is certainly a history of social work that's also, I think that we are in right now, that has always worked outside of that. But I think as somebody who also teaches social work, I think a lot of what I do is really have people question the institutions of social work, question the rules, and think about what skills you have and you have been learning and you probably came in with. Some of those skills that people come in with are actually disciplined into working a certain way within social work. So a lot of what we're doing, I think, is like breaking that, recalling legacies of the ways in which, and I think this is why mutual aid becomes more important than ever, in terms of a concept that's kind of been reimagined in this period, and that is more important than ever in terms of thinking for people who are officially and professionalized in social work. How do you do mutual aid work within your organizational setting or outside of that organizational setting? How do you do radical care? How do you dismantle systems of surveillance and carceral discipline? How do you sometimes work within them, but to do work? And I think this is where these kinds of concepts that we've been talking about lately, they have such terrible names, but reform and non-reform, reform, and all of this, that I know that we lift up again in our book, are like really important concepts to think through. How do we do things that might look like they're within a system or within kind of this liberal reform work that a lot of us have been operating under? And how is it that we do other kinds of work that break that? And how can you tell the difference? I think that's very, very important for us to teach, for us to think about every day, to see what that really looks like as conditions are changing rapidly, where things that we took for granted that we could do as maybe a little bit of a subversive work is going to be identified, that we really need to have these kind of internalized ways of discerning the work that we do. I mean, some of us are just good at doing that because we don't need, because they're so internalized already. But I think that that's really a service that we can do with kind of the intellectual works that we're producing in terms of these books that are also really accessible to practitioners. So that's a little bit about what I wanted to uplift at this point. And just also understanding that so many of us were outside of the law already and have been doing this anyways, but that we have been devaluing that work and that we really have to uplift that work and certainly leave it alone to continue.
Thank you so much, Mimi. And I'm actually going to pick up on that and this idea of discernment, and then I'll come to you if you want to join in. I mean, this, I guess, is a lesson that's been coming to me as I grapple with the reality of the moment and of sort of increasing fascism and abduction of people speaking out on Palestine and this sort of thing, and the attack on the state. And Mimi and I wrote a chapter for the book and also wrote an article about the relationship between abolition and the welfare state. And I think we didn't necessarily offer a prescription, but we were trying to dive into what does abolitionist politics and principles tell us about the welfare state. And I think, it tells us many things, and that there is not a singular analysis or ideology about the welfare state. And I've been thinking about how abolition is a politics and practice of preconfiguration. That is, to sort of, we need to name the world that we want and keep our eye on that because the day-to-day realities make that quite difficult. I think it is a politics and practice of destruction. It is a politics and practice of building. And we're in this moment where the Trump regime is sort of coming after everything, coming after the Department of Education, coming after Social Security, coming after all these public goods, coming after public universities. And I think there isn't a real shared analysis about the welfare portion of the state, about the public goods that come from the state. And the thing that I've been thinking about is abolition also, I think, at its best, is a politics and practice of precision. And I think that's hard to sell to a large group of people, but we need to get more precise about the things we want to hold on to and the things we want to fight for and the things we don't. And DEI, for example, in the US context, is not the greatest framework, and yet it has also offered some gains and is being sort of attacked and leveraged to dismantle public goods broadly. And so how do we make sense of a more specific analysis that allows us to organize in as unified way as possible? I mean, I'll say one other thing, which is we need this precision. At the same time, we need the biggest tent that we can get, because we, as Craig, you were pointing to, we're not powerful enough to stop a genocide, for example. We're not powerful enough. I'm hoping we're powerful enough in the US to save Social Security, because that's a really important thing that a lot of people get benefits from. So with that, Senna, I don't know if you want to add into this question, and then Craig is going to close us out with the last question.
So something I thought about while you were asking that question maybe was just how much we have to navigate in the work that we do at Passan and with cell count is just the level of censorship. So, the Correctional Service of Canada, for example, or, the Ontario Provincial Prison System, they work really hard to maintain a certain image of themselves, and they don't like when stuff gets out about them, right? They really try to suppress it, and so obviously cell count, we're always in an awkward position because we, the submissions that we receive are highly critical of corrections, do not make them look good. And it's people's raw experiences and truths. And, anyone who takes time to even read a single issue of Cell Count, you will have, if you thought one way about prisons, it will shift your perspective a lot. But in order to do that, we need to be able to access people inside, and they're always mediating our access. So, we have to be able to mail stuff in, they have to be able to call us, we have to be able to go inside. And in order to do all of that, we really have to, be careful of the language that we're using. We have to navigate a lot of these different relationships, and it's always a fine balance, because the folks inside are our main priority, and we want to very clearly show them that we're in solidarity with them, and everything that they're trying to do. But at the same time, we can't go to the front gate and be rude to the CO at the front, because they're not going to let us in. So it's always that fine balance of, we are trying to work with you to allow us in, so that we can do the work that we need to do with people inside. But in terms of navigating that censorship, everyone who works at Poseidon has to walk that fine line. Even people who are working out in the community, working with people who are criminalized, who need to access HIV care, and having to help people navigate medical institutions as well, that continue to do the work that the prisons started with them, right? To treat them in the same way. So yeah, I think that we've had to almost learn to split ourselves or compartmentalize a lot of things, because we all have very strong beliefs, and our beliefs have been shaped by working with people directly. And when we have to go and kind of like talk to healthcare staff and talk to corrections and things like that, and be careful about the ways that we challenge them, like that is very, very difficult and tricky work, for sure. And even having to negotiate to let cell count in, because cell count is actually banned by it's officially banned by all of the provincial institutions in BC, and is sort of unofficially banned by all the provincial institutions in Ontario. So the provincial institutions tend to be a lot more strict and highly censored. Then at the federal level, because people are inside for longer, they can actually be a bit more organized and push and file class actions and stuff like that a bit more. They just have more time to do that. So you'll see, a lot more progress at that level. So there is a little bit of less negotiation happening there. But yeah, I mean, we've had to work around censorship since the beginning, and but we found a way to do it, and we found a way to still be there for when people are organizing, to do whatever we can do on our end to support that. And I think that could kind of be extracted by other movements, especially when we're talking about Palestine, because there is so much censorship happening around Palestine on social media, in the news, and the ways, on campuses and stuff like that. Like, you can't use certain words now, or you're gonna set up a flag or something like that, or so there is still ways to do this work. It's just that you have to think differently, because I think it's so tempting to just be outspoken and to we see certain things in the prisons that are very disturbing and that go against everything that we believe in, and we have to hold it in, and remember at the same time that while we're holding it in, we're doing it for those folks inside, so that we can facilitate whatever movements are happening inside, right? In whatever ways we can on our end. But it's definitely possible. And I think something that I'm seeing parallels is just that level of censorship, and how more and more it just seems like more and more facets of our lives are and our views are coming under a certain type of control. that I think folks inside have to deal with all the time. But, you know, I see them speaking out and experiencing like physical punishment, mental abuse, you know, emotional abuse, all of these different types of abuses that they're experiencing, torture. And, you know, I still see people who have been in for decades still fighting every single day. And, you know, I think that something that's taught me is that we really can keep doing this and moving forward in these movements, especially on the outside, because, you know, we don't have to experience what people inside are experiencing, you know, but, you know, they're still making a lot of progress. So yeah, that's something that popped in my mind while you were asking that question, maybe. I hope that I kind of answered it.
Yeah, thank you so much, folks. So, given the time we have, I was thinking we could do just one last kind of rapid fire round. And I was thinking about there was a question that came out on the chat that somebody was asking a little bit about like social workers have this habit of trying to do everything themselves and have a hard time asking for help. And I think this is a commonality of anybody who's doing organizing work right now throughout our communities, and that's a reality because we don't have enough people all the time. Things are a lot, and so I'm wondering, maybe as a practical thing, like a rapid fire thing, if you like, if each of the panelists can tell like a skill or like a contribution that social workers might make to ongoing movements on the ground right now as we fight fascism and authoritarianism. If there's something that you think folks should get out and do a workshop on or skill training on, what would it be? Who wants to start us off?
I can jump in just to get things going, and this isn't the most well thought out response, but I'm thinking about the repression that's happening. Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia University, and he was just the first of several people who have been either taken or are targeted by ICE, and the way that repression and punishment is being used to try and suppress speech, particularly around Palestine, but really they're coming for everyone eventually. And I think, social work institutions are not being particularly anything around this. And I think social workers should be out in the streets. I think social workers should be connecting to organizations that are trying to fight this. And it's only one of many things, but I think the connection between punishment and carceral systems and abolition is just that punishment is being used by this administration at a scale that probably has not existed in my lifetime. And I think it's one organizing strategy that's maybe a broader tent. I'm going to try and keep it rapid. So joining an organization if you can, but if not, going out in the streets for protests. There's one tomorrow in Oahu that I'll be going to resist fascism and speak out against repression. I don't know who wants to go next.
Thanks, Cam. Maybe I'll guide us through. Mimi, did you want to go next?
Oh gosh, when you're saying that, you're talking to somebody who came up with a 600-page toolkit, so which is chock full of suggestions about how and skills you can use. So, so opposite of what Cam just said. It's all necessary, but I think bottom line, some of the skills around that is asking people what they need, and then partnering with people to figure out what's feasible in this moment and what needs to be built for the future. That is something social workers are trained to assume. We do active listening so that we can figure out what we already do that can meet their need and offer a very short menu. So I think that those are basic skills of organizing we're talking about as well. So that's what I'll offer, and then also remind you that there's a 600-page toolkit that has more ideas. Thank you.
And we'll get our tech Carlos to link to that toolkit when we're all said and done. Jarrell, did you want to speak next?
Um, hmm. I just think social workers have a natural ability to build relationships. So whether that's getting people to come out, figuring things out, drawing the crowd for whatever reason possible, I think we're really good at that. So I think one thing that you guys can do a workshop on, if you so please, is just like, how do you build a network, and then how do you mobilize folks? I think it could be something that's good.
Thanks, Jarrell. Chanel, did you want to go next?
I don't know that I have anything more to add. That, you know, I was like, I do think I you know, I like, Cameron, when you gave the example of like social workers against criminalization. I'm like, just get into a group, guys. You need to be in networks. If you're not, you absolutely, the best thing for your safety is a group of peers. I think about this a lot. Of safety is you know, because I think a lot about repression and criminalization for obvious reasons. And that just feels like the safest formation is for you to have a core group that you are tight with and you're communicating over a secure platform, please, with. And then from there, all the things that everyone else has said, but to just start with a crew of people around a kitchen table or over a secure platform is really the core of like solving social problems. Basically, that's actually where it starts. So, yeah, I think that's what I'd say.
Thanks, Chanel. And Senna, want to go next?
When you asked that question, I thought about the students that we work with at Pasan, placement students. So they often come in with some are, you know, identify as abolitionists before, so they are already pretty politicized around it. But some students aren't, and to, you know, have those students kind of sit with us and listen to our observations and talk to people directly on the phone who are calling from inside, write to people inside, you know, assist folks with what they need. Just that, it completely shifts people's perspectives, completely, from the beginning of the placement to the end. So I would say just talking to students, because they're a lot of them are still quite young, and you know, if we kind of are able to bring students into these movements at a younger age, and kind of have people talking to you know, for in our case, people inside directly, that already is going to shape them into being a social worker that is probably different than a lot of the other social workers that graduate out of these programs. Yeah, so I would say something like that, just finding a way to bring students in, maybe doing some workshops with some students, and you know, shaping their practices at a younger age.
Thanks, Senna. And I think my contribution would really be, you know, from my experience organizing, the one thing that is really challenging is we're going to have to go through conflict. We're going to have to be able to argue with each other about what we do, when we do it, how we do it, who's doing what, and so on and so forth. And we need to build those conflict resolution skills. It's really challenging in this day and age on social media, in which the people just, everyone's got hot takes, but no one has any constructive way of moving through that conflict. And I do think if we are doing this training and we're going through this schooling, or we're having experience in community doing conflict resolution work, get out and get involved in movements, be a part of them, and offer those skills when needed, right? If you need to be that person who's going to help. I've been through so many groups that have broken up over internal conflicts that were doing good political work. And we need to be able to deal with that, particularly now when the heat is on and it's heavier and more stressful and more like necessary to be mobilizing. So with that, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our ability to build these cross-border alliances, and in the spirit of Turtle Island, despite the continued isolation that is going on between our two states by our political elites. And I think it's really important that we continue these relationships and build with each other and have each other's backs. And so thank you, Mimi and Joel and Senna and Cam and Chanel. And thank you to Haymarket and Carlos for putting this on. Hopefully we've given you a little bit of a taste of the two books and how we kind of relate to one another, but definitely go out and check the books out if you haven't already. And we are really grateful for having you here. So thank you so much.